Hello there, I'm Nick Clark. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, Mozambique's troubled road to becoming the world's fourth biggest gas exporter, a debt crisis, an unequal society, and an Islamist uprising near its most valuable gas fields. Also this week, an epic battle to challenge Apple's grip on its App Store, the multi-billion-dollar gaming company taking on the tech giants and the regulators watching from the wings. The mighty dollar sinks, but is this a stumble that upends its dominance, or is that wishful thinking on the road to a currency war? So then, in time, Mozambique will become the fourth biggest exporter of gas, but right now it's fast becoming the most unequal society in sub-Saharan Africa. The promise of gas riches could not come quickly enough for a nation mired in a debt scandal that plunged the country into a currency crisis and debt default. Almost 4 years on, the pandemic and an insurgency in the far north, where the country has its most valuable offshore gas deposits, are crippling the economy. Well, in the worst-case scenario, the economy is expected to contract 2% this year. That's according to the African Development Bank. With gas prices hitting a 25-year low, some international oil giants are rethinking their plans. Exxon, which is operating the biggest project in the gas-rich province of Cabo Delgado, worth as much as $30 billion, has postponed indefinitely a final investment decision. But France's Total, they are pushing ahead after securing financing for its $20 billion investment in the same region. When gas does begin to flow during the middle of this decade, the government is expected to receive up to $100 billion in revenue, which is about 7 times the current size of its economy. The biggest threat to these projects could be, though, the insurgency, with the militants pledging allegiance to ISIL. In August, the militants captured Mocimboa da Praia, a strategic port, for the third time this year. There have been numerous attacks in the Cabo Delgado region over the past 3 years. The country's elite forces are guarding gas facilities, leaving undertrained soldiers to fight the insurgency. The militants have seen off Kremlin-backed guns for hire from the Wagner Group. And in April, the government hired Dick Advisory Group to provide helicopters fitted with machine guns to support its troops, and that with little effect. And the insurgency could drag on in other nations. Well, more than 1,500 people have been killed and at least 210,000 have had to leave their homes. Let's take this on. Joining me from Johannesburg is Piers Pigu. Piers is a senior consultant for Southern Africa for the International Crisis Group. Piers, welcome to the show. First up, these insurgent attacks are increasingly sophisticated. How linked are they to ISIL?
Well, it's a million-dollar question in many ways, Nick. No one is really sure. IS Central Africa Province, which launched its franchise in April last year, covering activities of the ADF in Uganda and the DRC, the Eastern DRC, opened up the Mozambican front in June last year. And since then, we've seen approximately 40 claims for attacks that have taken place in Cabo Delgado. Bear in mind, that's 40 attacks out of a total of over 500 attacks in the last nearly 3 years. But as you indicate, we've seen increasing levels of sophistication in the strategy and tactics that have employed, and some concerns about more sophisticated weaponry in play. And this has raised questions about IS influence. Certainly, we see the connection in the media jihad that has been at play attached to the claims of responsibility. But the hard evidence of IS engagement and actors on the ground is still speculative.
And now we know that civilians have been used as human shields by the armed group. Nearly 1,000 have died. But there's also this distrust between civilians and the military. How much trust is there in the government itself?
Well, it's a complicated situation, and that part of Cabo Delgado, the 5 provinces that are specifically affected, contain a large number of people in those communities who have for some time been somewhat alienated and a sense of marginalization from central government. There are ethnic, religious and political dynamics in play here as well. And there is some concern that elements of these communities are supportive of the insurgent groupings. Although in many respects, you have to remember these communities are caught in the middle of a burgeoning insurgency, of violent and very nasty tactics that are being employed by insurgents, but also concerns about the violations that are being perpetrated by government security forces under the rubric of their counterinsurgency strategy. So there's a really serious set of challenges facing civilians trying to survive in this situation.
Right, and there's irony here, isn't there? Because potentially there's a huge amount of wealth coming into Mozambique, and yet this whole area is one of the poorest parts of the country. This feeling of marginalization is very much driving this, isn't it?
Well, there are different schools of thought in terms of how you weight all these different factors, but certainly these background concerns have been in play for a very long time and are important contributing factors to understanding why there was this drift into an insurgency, which essentially started off as a sectarian tensions in the region between local Muslim groups and has morphed now into this burgeoning insurgency.
The Mozambican military isn't well equipped. At one point, they actually ran out of ammunition. But you've got these private contractors that the government has brought in. But can we really understand? Can we get a grasp of what the government is trying to do here?
Well, the government, as you may have heard, has been reaching out for assistance, but it wants to develop that assistance on its own terms. We see pro-government commentators saying we don't need boots on the ground from SADC, for example. We need assistance in relation to intelligence cooperation, improving surveillance, maybe some bespoke contributions to maritime security, those kinds of things, as opposed to launching a battalion of SADC-based troops onto the ground. Certainly, the government security forces are woefully ill-equipped and not well led, it would seem. We're talking about two arms of the security services. The police have actually been leading the operation. You have a kind of a paramilitarized police operating in that area, but the military are increasingly involved again. But there are understandably tensions between these two elements within the security services and tensions within both of those sectors. And this is feeding into challenges around command and control. And bear in mind, this is also a hugely difficult logistical challenge. Maputo is a couple of thousand kilometers away from the scene of action, and a lot of the supply lines are coming from that far south in the country. So this is a complex situation. The reliance on private military companies, in particular the Dyke Advisory Group, has been about providing some aerial backbone to the counterinsurgency threat, but we now see that has developed into some on-the-ground training for ground troops, because that's been lacking, having an effective attack force that can take on the insurgents, and that is what the Dyke Advisory Group, I understand, is now busy working on in terms of training.
Right, Piers, you mentioned SADC there, the regional organisation. I mean, there is a key issue here for regional security. Isn't it important that they do get involved?
Well, yes, it is. But, there's a kind of a sovereignty dance going on. Mozambique was pushed to the table, really, by the SADC's security organ, the organ for politics, defence and security in May. And in that meeting, it was asked to develop a roadmap of how it felt the regional member states could assist. Now, that's back in May. It's almost 4 months later, and that roadmap hasn't been put in front of SADC. This was one of the reasons they had little more to say than to offer solidarity and some kind of verbal support at the SADC summit last month. And so the region is waiting for this, and it really cannot impose itself on Mozambique. And in this context, there is a sense that the region is dragging its heels, but essentially the drive must come from Mozambique. But there are also questions about the competencies and capacities of SADC member states to be able to offer assistance in a context where it is already overstretched in terms of its security competencies in the region. It has troops in the DRC, and in most instances, the security forces have got significantly reduced budgets.
Yeah, plenty of questions to be asked. Thank you for helping us answer some of them. Piers Pigu, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
So now the dollar is taking something of a battering against a whole host of currencies. The reasons are numerous: the pandemic, low interest rates, patchy growth, the Fed's decision to allow inflation to fly. They all sound plausible until you start to think that all nations are going through the same predicament, and some are in a worse position. Well, the US currency is near its lowest level in 2 years. It's down about 10% from its 2020 peak against many of its peers. And according to Ulf Lindahl, the chief investment officer of the currency manager AG Bissett, the US currency will plunge 36% against the euro over the next year or so, taking it to levels it's not seen in more than a decade. Goldman Sachs predicts negative real rates in the United States are a sustained recipe for dollar weakness and forecasts the euro to trade at $1.30 by 2023. At the current exchange rate of $1.18, Eurozone growth could take a hit of up to 0.4%. And that's crucial as policymakers are hoping for a strong export-led recovery to minimize job losses. Well, that's some of the predictions, and let's put them to Jamil Ahmed, who is the Director of Investment Strategy at the German-founded platform Naga. So Jamil, first up, give us a breakdown as to what the Fed's decision to allow inflation to rise. What does that mean for the dollar?
So it's symbolic because the goalposts have changed. So eventually the target is no longer, we're going to look for inflation to reach 2%. By the way, this is something that hasn't been able to do for a decade. But instead, for as long as the economy benefits, which means we get strong economic data, and employment is maximized to its full potential, we would allow inflation to go above 2% for as long as it provides benefits. So that would be a thumbs up for the US economic momentum. But in a hypothetical world, this should structurally lower and weaken the US dollar. But hypothetical and what happens in reality is completely different because financial markets are fluid. They can blow hot water and they can blow cold water. So what we did see initially was the US dollar against a basket of different currencies fell to its lowest levels in over 2 years. This led to the euro reaching 1.20, which is as high as in 2.5 years. But since the beginning of September, the dollar has actually been on a little bit of a Rocky-style comeback, if you like that sort of movie. And since then, the euro has fallen from 1.20 to as low as 1.17. And the British pound has particularly fell from just below 1.35 to below 1.30. So it comes down to whether inflation really does hit 2% in the US economy and whether that would happen anytime soon. And the other thing at play is whether other central banks begin to play a game of copycat. And this would determine whether the US dollar goes higher or lower over the longer term on an inflation question.
And what's your sense of that? Will they play copycat?
Absolutely, it's possible. Look, we are in an unprecedented time where you're seeing a pandemic, worst one we've seen for 100 years. Economies everywhere are suffering. No matter who you are or what you do, you know the economy is suffering. So what I do think we are seeing is the change of the textbook. You have more conventional methods of the past. We will target a specific rate towards perhaps turning the page or starting a new book altogether. And the world has to adapt. So this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but what it comes down to as well is whether it does start some sort of currency war or whether it's a cold war, and whether economies are doing it for their own benefit because we want to see our own economy recover from what has been a horrifying past 6 months, or whether it comes down to other tactics.
And if we do enter an era of currency wars, what will that do to the global economy?
We've used the term currency war a lot over the past 5 to 6 years, specifically during the Trump presidency. But in fact, what we are seeing here is not a currency war as such, because it is to target economic growth. It's not to be labeled as a currency manipulator. You're seeing instead is environments to improve the economies to have fallen so sharply due to the pandemic. So it's not a currency war, perhaps it's a bit of a cold war. And if other countries do follow the path of actually trying to determine the value of their currencies, we could call it more of a currency war then. But right now it's not. It's another act of stimulus during very unprecedented and unconventional times. So the war just has to adapt to this.
Right, an active stimulus may be, but the thing is, if any other central bank was attempting to increase inflation in this way that had an impact on the currency, then Washington would definitely label them as currency manipulators, wouldn't they?
Yeah, this is true, but again, that is in a theatric and a pantomime world. The truth is that what you are labeled, and yes, the US administration throughout this whole Trump presidency so far has at times labeled currencies and economies certain things, but the reality in terms of market fluctuations has been completely different. Throughout the Trump presidency, the US dollar has actually been significantly strong, and it's been at its strongest levels at some points since before 2010. So we've actually seen a stronger dollar, and because of the stronger dollar, global currencies everywhere, but whether you're in emerging markets, you're in South Asia, you're in Africa, developed currencies like the British pound, euro, or anywhere else in the world, you've actually seen your currency be weakened, less purchasing power against the US dollar, because the US dollar has reigned supreme now for the past 5 or so years. And perhaps that cycle does need to come to an end at some point. But having said that, even if the cycle does come to an end, a weaker dollar does not mean stronger US economy necessarily, because actually on an export level, exports for the US economy match something like 12%, but for countries like the United Kingdom and for the European Union economy, it's double that. And for some emerging markets, it's even more spectacular higher. So it's actually quite critical that the dollar is able to remain strong in order for other currencies to be able to recover, because the dynamics of every economy are different.
It's all speculation, isn't it? But if this era of the declining dollar is here to stay, how long might it stay, and what impact would that have on economies who are reliant on dollar investments?
It's a great question. Markets generally run in cycles. It can be 5 to 6 years. We've actually been in the cycle of a stronger dollar since the second half of 2014 now. And even today, despite the fact that it's dropped off by 5% over the past 6 months, it's still only at its weakest level in 2.5 years. To give you a little bit of perspective on this, if we were back in 2014 time, British pound was valued about 170. You had the euro, which was valued at close to 140. Today, that currency respectively is valued at under 120, and you've got the British pound that's actually below 130. So the dollar has remained strong, and it's the same whether you're the Australian currency, New Zealand currency, and if you're South Asia specifically, Chinese yuan, Malaysian ringgit, you have seen a stronger dollar prevail for a number of years. It would probably be in the best interest of the economic recovery following the pandemic, and hopefully a cure will come to become the hero soon, but it would help actually if the dollar can remain stronger for another couple of years yet. Time will tell, of course, and the devil's always in the detail, but I don't see the change of the inflation tactic from the Federal Reserve essentially meaning that the dollar will weaken on headline and stay that way. Other central banks will also have to move in accordance.
Jamil Ahmed, thanks for unraveling all of that for us. Appreciate it. Now then, an epic battle is brewing in the tech world that could challenge a duopoly and trigger far-reaching regulatory investigations. The maker of Fortnite, that's Epic Games, is taking on Apple in the courts over the iPhone maker's insistence that all software on its app store must pay a 30% cut of subscriptions. Apple kicked Fortnite off its platform after Epic had developed its own payment system to bypass Apple. The European Union is already investigating Apple over its in-app payment systems. Well, joining me now via Skype from London is Piers Harding-Rolls. Piers is the Research Director of Games for Ampere Analysis. And Piers, so let's look at this. Epic is very clear about it. It believes Apple should be paid for distribution, but as a company that made $1.8 billion last year, it says that 30% is too high a price to pay. Do you think there's a halfway house that could accommodate both parties?
Possibly. I think, obviously there's a lot of pressure that's building on Apple in the context of the different investigations that are going on in Europe, and also other companies which are putting pressure on Apple to reduce this fee, this in-app processing fee of 30%. So, and Apple has also had a history of compromise. So in terms of subscription services, it has dropped its fee of 30% to 15% after 1 year. So there is a history there of compromise. So possibly they'll come to some arrangement around the cost of app processing fees.
Right, and all the while, the regulators are watching this very, very closely, aren't they? They want to rein in the power of the big tech companies. What can regulators do you think?
Yeah, so there's this antitrust investigation going on by the EU based on Spotify's complaints around app processing fees in Europe. And obviously there's the general inquiries in the US around the potential monopolies of these companies. I think they'll just wait and see what happens in this private case in the context of Epic and Apple. If it's proven, i.e. if Epic wins, then obviously this gives more strength for sort of state bodies to act more progressively in terms of this.
In the bigger arena, the gaming industry has, well, really, it's had a great pandemic, isn't it? People have been at home and gaming has been a means of a distraction and an escape. Who have been the big winners?
I think actually the whole industry has benefited really from people spending more time at home, obviously more free time, locked up at home and looking for things to do. And games has always been a high value proposition. It's not a lot of money to invest in a games experience, and it gives you tons of hours of enjoyment. So all the companies that have reported, all the public companies that reported, have been reporting record performances over the last couple of quarters. And, the industry as a whole has entirely benefited. It's about, I guess, when we come out of this kind of lockdown environment, it's about how those companies continue to engage the users that have come afresh into the gaming ecosystem. And, how do you keep that audience interested and engaged in the products?
Right, because there's a huge amount of money to be made, isn't there? And is being made by the likes of Microsoft's Xbox, Sony's PlayStation, and Nintendo. But now Netflix and Amazon, they're trying to make an inroad in there. What will that mean for the game industry?
So there's quite a lot of disruptive change going on in the sector. One of the big areas of interest is cloud gaming and the provision of on-demand services, so kind of instant play, access to games content. That means potentially addressing a much larger audience of consumers with higher quality content. You think about Netflix, obviously, big subscription video on-demand service. They have this history of reaching audiences across the globe for on-demand content. So that seems that there would be a kind of fit in their sort of business strategy to start shifting into more progressively into more interactive content, which they have been experimenting with. And then on Amazon's point, they have a huge cloud business, which is the sort of underpinning of those kind of on-demand services. Where they have weaknesses, I mean, Amazon doesn't really have the content play and the content capabilities that companies like PlayStation, Microsoft, and Nintendo have in terms of their studios to produce this content and the IP. And then if you think about Netflix, it doesn't really have that expertise in the game sector or the cloud capability of someone like Amazon. So both of those companies have weaknesses, but it does mean that the whole sector is becoming more competitive, and the biggest technology companies, I mean, there is no big technology company out there that is not interested in the game sector. So it is a highly competitive space.
You mentioned cloud gaming. We've got Microsoft and Samsung getting together on that. What's that all about?
So that's really a marketing relationship, I would say. So there's benefits for both parties there. From Xbox and Microsoft's point of view, basically they want to reach bigger audiences with their products. So they're reaching beyond the console platforms into, as I was saying, cloud gaming services which reach mobile devices. And obviously Samsung wants to sell more mobile devices, so they've tied up this deal to give buyers of the new products that Samsung's bringing to market access to Xbox Game Pass Ultimate, which is their subscription service, which will be shifting into the cloud very shortly. And from Samsung's point of view, they're being competed with from other phone manufacturers that are producing what we'd consider to be kind of gaming phones, which compete for a significant audience with Samsung's own products. And Samsung is looking to sort of position its products as gaming capable. And so there's this deal that they've tied up.
Some terrific analysis there, Piers. Thanks very much indeed for that. Piers Harding-Rolls, thank you.
Thank you.
And that is our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything you've seen, you can tweet me at Nick Clark Al Jazz. Just use the hashtag AJCDC, or indeed you can email us. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. And there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That will take you straight to our page, which has this and past episodes for you to catch up on. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Nick Clark from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is coming up.